name is Sam Felton, and welcome to Expert Interviews here on Smash the Fat. Today we've got an absolutely epic guest with us. Now, before we get into that, I just need to apologise to everybody on the podcast, because the last of the couple podcasts actually didn't have any sound on them. Apparently the conversion didn't go very well. So just so you know, I've updated that audio. So if you haven't re-downloaded the audio, then it's updated audio with the actual sound. Now, going back to our interview today, we've got an absolutely fantastic guest that did an absolutely incredible meta-analysis a couple of weeks ago that was published in PLOS One, the online journal, and he's an incredible guy that's also done an incredible TED talk over in Brussels on It's Not Too Late to Ever Change. With me today is Dr. Jonathan Sackner-Bernstein. How's it going, Jonathan?
Good morning. It's going well. I'm happy to be with you today.
It's absolutely fantastic. And it sounds like you've had quite a career from reading your bio, because you're actually co-sponsored by the FDA and the White House at the same time. Is that right?
So I was at the FDA, and we launched a program that was initiated by the White House. So we got to work with their Office of Science and Technology Policy, which was really a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And you come from as an academic cardiologist background as well. And kind of over the years, it seems that you're trying to really look for effective treatments, really. And your latest meta-analysis, which is, as I mentioned earlier, in PLOS One, the link is in the description for those of you on YouTube, and it's called Dietary Intervention for Overweight and Obese Adults, Comparison of Low Carbohydrate and Low Fat Diets, the title of today's talk, and meta-analysis. Now, before we kind of get into the ins and outs of that meta-analysis, which was absolutely fascinating because it's the first one that uses probability with its statistics. How exactly did you get into the position that you are today? Because it seems like it's been quite a journey.
Well, I think the key is that if you have opportunities to make a difference in your community, in your field, that you've got to seize those opportunities. And I've really been lucky that I've been in situations where I've essentially been able to make choices based on whether something was interesting and something could lead to some good. And by doing that, I've been able to tackle some really important and oftentimes enjoyable and every single time challenging projects, and have had a good time. And I'm working to make a difference. That's my goal.
Absolutely. Now, going back to this meta-analysis, as I mentioned, it's really just a comparison of low carbohydrate and low fat diets. And it's kind of pulls all of the randomized controlled trials that are over 8 weeks between 1966 to 2014. And one of the most important things that you do in your study selection that a lot of meta-analyses don't do, and you mentioned this in your discussion about the fact that the definition of low carbohydrate was 120 grams a day. In your definitions, and then low fat diet, as you'll know, less than or equal to 30% of energy a day as well. And a lot of other meta-analyses have done like less than or equal to 45% of energy as well. So were you very aware of those flaws in other meta-analyses kind of going into this?
Well, there are two ways of looking at that first step of deciding what studies to include in a meta-analysis. Mm-hmm. One is to say, I'm going to try to include the broadest range of studies, the biggest number of people, to see what I can see. And you know, that's one approach. I'm not sure I'd call it a fault, but I think that it's a limitation if you're trying to ask a question about the relative effect on weight loss of these two diets. Because if you want to know the difference between two dietary strategies, what you want to do is say, okay, if I'm going to pick the studies that really focused on strict adherence. Now, with the dietary study, it's hard to comply, just like we all know it's really hard to comply with any dietary strategy in real life. So if you start out with this very loose um, uh, entry criteria into a study where low carbohydrate is going from, huge numbers of carbohydrates to only excessive, well, that's not really asking the question that I was interested in. My question, and I think the question that's asked most commonly, and which is addressed in your book as well, is if you're going to adhere to a strategy of reducing carbohydrates versus adhering to a strategy of reducing fat, which are two of the advocated positions, then let's say what's a strict adherence? And so that's how we came up with the criteria for the inclusion in this meta-analysis.
Fantastic. And kind of through that study selection, you managed to pull 17 trials together, 12 of which are less than a year follow-up as well. I think you wanted to clarify, is that correct?
Yes, most of them were a year or under.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of the basic findings were that low carbohydrate diets have significant reductions in weight and significant reductions in risk of cardiovascular events as well. Would you say that's kind of the basic results?
Yeah, so you latched on in your first comments about the fact that we used probability assessments. So one of the things that was unique to this meta-analysis compared to others is that we wanted to make it an analysis that used statistics in order to give an answer that people could understand. And when I say people, I'm not talking about the lay public, even though that's true there too. I'm talking about practicing clinicians, whether it be a doc, a nurse, a dietitian. Really, a very small subset of people understand what p-values and confidence intervals and null hypotheses mean. So why do we hide behind stuff like that when we're trying to give advice to the broader community? I'm not really sure. So the first thing we decided we're going to do is we're going to do the analysis in a way that people could understand as if it were their only their language, in English, in everyday language, in any language. Sorry to be so North American, U.S. centric. I know you're probably thinking I should say American and not English is the language, but that said,
American English.
Yes. So the idea would be if I'm a patient going into a provider and I want to lose weight, and I go to my provider, whether it be a nutritionist or a doc, and I say, what diet should I start with? I don't want that person giving me a lot of statistics. I want that person telling me, well, if you choose A, whatever the A is, you've got a 90% chance of losing weight more than the other approaches. If you choose B, you've got 80% better than C, but really A has the highest likelihood of working. Well, that's great, because then I know that if I'm going to start something that's hard, at least my first time starting, I'm starting with one that has the highest likelihood of working. So that was one thing we did that was unique and hadn't been done before by applying this method called Bayesian statistics. And we were able to show with very rigorous math, and in fact, we put the entire database and all the computer code for the statistics on the PLOS ONE website, so anybody can download it. They can test us. They can see if we did anything wrong, which we did. Believe me, we tried it a bunch of different ways. These numbers are right. And what it showed was with 99% confidence, my practitioner could tell me, Jonathan, if you want to lose weight, you're going to lose more weight with a low carbohydrate than with a low fat. I can tell you that with 99% confidence. Now, I might be in the 1%, but and it's the other that works for me, but at least I know where I'm starting from a position of confidence. And then the second thing we did that had not been done in prior meta-analyses and touched on in a very limited fashion in the actual studies was look at risk. In an ideal circumstance, somebody would pony up, I don't know, $50 million, $60 million, and there would be a long-term randomized trial of these two diets to see what it did to heart attacks. But nobody's going to spend 100 or $2 million, 50, 60, 100. I mean, it's going to be some crazy number.
Mm-hmm.
People have tried to figure this out. The NIH certainly isn't going to do it. The National Health Service isn't going to do it. So the best we can do then is look at the predictive equations that tens and hundreds of studies have contributed to show what the likelihood is of having a heart attack or a stroke that you either survive or die from. So there are some equations that were updated by the National Institutes of Health, NHLBI, the Institute National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, just about a year, 18 months ago. We took the data from each of those 17 studies, put it into that equation, and where we couldn't figure out, because some data were missing, we basically would take a best case and worst case, knowing that it's somewhere in between there, the truth, that brackets the range of possibilities. And what we learned is that the low-carbohydrate diet was 98% likely to reduce your predicted risk more than the standard low-fat diet. So all of the resistance to low carbohydrate, and people want to talk about the quality of fat, saturated, unsaturated, very important questions.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime, you take the best data that exists from these 17 trials of strict adherence to low fat or low carb, and now I know with 99% confidence I'm going to lose more weight if I start with low carb than if I start with low fat. And with 98% confidence, I'm going to be lowering my risk of a heart attack or stroke with low carb more than I would with low fat. Now, both diets are good, but I think when you're talking about 98% more effective, 99% more effective, and 98% safer, it's pretty obvious where you should be on the priority list of your decision making.
Absolutely, and also in terms of where dietary guidelines should be as well. You actually suggest that in your conclusions, in your discussion specifically. You say in conclusion, this trial-level meta-analysis of 17 randomized controlled trials shows that both low-carbohydrate and low-fat diets are effective in reducing weight. However, low-carbohydrate diets appear to achieve greater weight loss and reduction in predicted risk of cardiovascular events compared with low-fat diets. On the basis of these results, we suggest that dietary recommendations for weight loss should be revisited to consider this additional evidence to the benefits of low-carbohydrate diets. So when the USDA come out with dietary recommendations, I think it's next month quite possibly, or maybe even at the end of this month, they should be including this in some sort of way.
They definitely should, and I'm a little bit frustrated because I think, in essence, I started this project too late, because we already know what the USDA and HHS Dietary Guidelines Advisory Group recommendations are going to be, and they're not going to make low carbohydrate approaches to be first line approach. They're not going to say they're bad, but they're not going to make them a first line approach. And what they're going to focus on is a shift that in some ways is very small, but in other ways is monumental, because you have a group that's changing what they've said before. So before they were strictly saying low fat, low fat, low fat. They're backing away from that, talking about saturated fats versus unsaturated fats. And I think that's a great sign, because if you think about the kinds of people who are usually on guidelines committees, there's an incredible ego about, I'm right, I understand this, I am the master. And that's great. We want that personality for guidelines, because they take ownership and they really focus on bringing a lot of disparate opinions and data sources together. Now, I think in the dietary guidelines example, it's very easy for an outside observer to say, well, but they messed up, because we've had these clinical trials for the last 15 years, certainly. Yeah. What's taking them so long? I don't know what's taking them so long. I think that there is great resistance to change in people. Oftentimes people like to talk about conflicts of interest with financial conflicts, with funding. Mm-hmm. I think that a much more insidious kind of conflict is an intellectual conflict of interest. Yeah. You've got people who believe that they evaluated this, they know the right answer, and it's very hard to then say, hey, I was wrong. You highlight a hero of science and data interpretation in your book, who's one of the few people who had Tim Noakes, who says he's wrong. I mean, I don't say I'm wrong. What I try to do is I just try to stick, because I've got the ego problem also, is I at least say, okay, I'm going to be in love with data and data analysis. I'm not going to be in love with a product. So that's why I'll talk about data. If the conclusions end up being shown to be wrong because new data gives more insight, well, I'm not really wrong. I just was right with the data that I had.
Yeah.
But Tim Noakes is a different story, and I don't think there's the Tim Noakes kind of courage in these in this advisory group, because they're coming out with it. It's not really going to include this, and I've got to be pushing for 2020.
Unfortunately so. Luckily, you guys do actually review every 5 years. In the UK, the Eat Well plate has been around for over 10 years now, and hasn't had any kind of revamp whatsoever. Hopefully next year there's going to be a bit of movement with that, but we'll see.
Yeah.
Going back to this probability approach, which I think is, I mean, firstly, it's unique. It's the first of its kind within this meta-analysis. And you mentioned earlier that it was a Bayesian analysis itself. So why did you choose this approach specifically compared to any other statistical analysis there?
Well, there are two different ways of answering that. One is having read a bunch of statistics, having read a bunch of statistics books, getting abused at home when an Amazon package will show up and it's some secondhand statistics book, and my family look at it, it's like, oh my God, what is Dad reading now? So I love statistics, and I'm not an expert, but I've gotten increasing amount of expertise over the years from being interested in it. But I'm struck by the fact that a very, very small portion of people, even amongst those who write papers with statistics, actually understand statistics. I think I've gotten to the point where I can recognize that now, even if I'm not smart enough to be able to teach those people why they're not seeing it. I'm good enough to recognize the same shortcomings I have, but without the recognition on their part. And then the second, and so, I wanted to come up with a way to tackle a question like this using a method that is easier to understand and I think fits into decision making in a much more direct fashion. There's a whole science of decision making and decision sciences, they call it, which really rests on a lot of these Bayesian principles. And we talk about the fact that it's new to this application. It's the first time it's been done in a dietary assessment. We wouldn't want people to think this is some statistical method that was invented in the last couple of years. Bayes was around, quite some time ago, and he didn't even speak American English. But the method is one that I became familiar with when I worked at the Food and Drug Administration, and in the Center for Devices, there are some of the most incredible biostatisticians I've met. And I say that not because they necessarily can run stats better than anybody else, because I'm not good enough to tell that. But what I have seen is that they understand how to use statistics and communicate with statistics in a way that makes it easier for really hard decisions to be made. And one of their tools is Bayesian statistics. So I learned from the people there enough to realize that there were ways to do it. And then you look at some of the tools that are available on the market, and they're open source tools that anybody can use to run these statistics. There's an R community, there's a bugs community, there's a JAGS community, and all of these have so much information posted on Stack Exchange and places like that, that you can see sample code, you can ask people questions, they get answers. It's a living community. You don't have to go out and spend several $1,000s on SAS and then several more $1,000s on a SAS course. You can just jump right in and start learning and doing statistics. And this makes it accessible to people. And again, you can use our code, and you can see it's not incredibly sophisticated in its structure. It's not written to you the smallest number of lines or the smallest number of CPU cycles. It's really written in a way that we could construct it so that as we're doing it as non-stat. Oh, I'm a non-statistician. I had some real statisticians working with me.
Yeah.
You could share it with a non-statistician, and you can see the structure. Okay, now we're going to, in the next section, we're going to calculate the different risk scores for the different groups. And instead of setting up some complex loops that are impossible to figure out with variable names that make no sense, everything's written out in longhand, so that there's really very little looping, so that you can really see what's going on. And if you want to test one particular aspect of it that you don't believe we got right, you can do that very easily as well.
That's fantastic. And that's kind of, the beauty of the world that we're living in now. Everything's getting more and more transparent. Everything's becoming more and more open source, so that those that do have concerns of the methodology can go run it themselves, and they can kind of check if you did it right on their standards, and then they can be satisfied with your answers and your conclusions, right?
Yeah, so one of the things I loved about the Public Library of Science Plus, and in this case Plus One, is the way they make it easy to share. So increasingly, journals are allowing you to put supplementary material up.
Mm-hmm.
But when I looked at different journals I was thinking of submitting to, one of the things I noticed was that if I wanted to include my database, which has, 200 columns of data for the 17 studies,
mm-hmm.
I would have actually had to save it as a PDF file and upload the PDF file. Well, that's great. People can look at it, but nobody can use that to then run any analysis, or
mm-hmm.
they can't repurpose the database for their own analysis. And similarly with the R code, I wanted to just put it up as a text file. Well, you can't. Again, it's got to be a PDF. Now, you can convert a PDF into a text file pretty easily, and
mm-hmm.
a PDF into a database not quite as easily, but still easily. But that's a ridiculous way to do things. If you really want to make it easy for someone to double check and create not only peer review when you submit it, but let the peers come after you later, after it's been published, then it should be something where you can just put it up there where people can just use it, like by clicking on it, and boom, they can use it. Make it easy for the community to really test and make sure people are doing this right. You look at the data. You see, did we extract the data correctly from the trials? Because you can go get the papers too. Everything then, if it's open, and everything if it's transparent, I think gives a level of confidence. And look, maybe we did do something wrong. If somebody can figure that out, that's great. Maybe somebody can figure out another way to do this that's even more enlightened. That's great too.
Absolutely. And Plus One has a comment section. So if you are one of those people, then you can actually go comment on the paper itself. And I assume that emails straight through to you any comments. And then you could, improve it for the next time.
Yeah, and I think that it's that's one of the things that any of the, especially professionals who are listening, should think about. Starting back when I was in training, I used to write letters or call people when I read their paper, and then because you're a young guy, Sam, you probably don't know this.
I've had the internet since I was 15. So.
But there was a time when you'd have to write letters or pick up the phone to find somebody.
What? That sounds crazy.
It is crazy. but now you can just click on the email on the paper that's on the web. Your email comes up. You send an email, and I'll tell you, when we were doing this paper, I was emailing authors a bunch, and authors are incredibly generous at explaining stuff to you. There was one paper where some information was missing. An author told me where there was another publication that actually had that data in it.
Wow.
So I was able to go get it. I mean, it was a paper that didn't end up qualifying because the fat restriction was too loose. But it was just a great example of how, if you want to engage in the community, you can do that from the point of view of being a reader, from the point of view of being a critic, from the point of view of being a curious question asker, or actually doing a study.
Absolutely, it's incredible, and kind of with this coming out in the way that you've done it. I see kind of real potential for progression here in the conversation as well, because you just have this kind of rhetoric going back and forth between the two sides. But when you kind of add in this probability, then you say, look, you're just more likely to lose weight on a low carbohydrate diet, so it makes sense that's where you should start. And that's kind of what primary care physicians should be sort of saying. Look, this is the level of probability of all the diets. Choose which one might resonate best with yourself, but the likelihood is that a low carbohydrate diet would be your best bet.
Right. So it's and the reason that people have cited in the part of the field that I've observed where it's the opinion leaders, where they've stopped short of, they said, well, yeah, you can lose more weight over a few months, but we don't know if it's safe. And now we know that it's safer than low fat. And in fact, if you look really critically at the data on low fat, there's not really data that says that lowers your risk all that much. Mm-hmm. So all of these different impacts are relatively modest for the individual. And that's why it's so critical that an individual gets every single advantage she or he can get. So you start with the thing that's going to work the best. And then when you multiply that across a larger group of people, you start seeing the potential for societal impact. And this risk thing is very fascinating, because you'll see some of these studies really skirt around the issue. So there was one of them that is included in our meta-analysis that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which I think that most of my peers would say, in terms of clinical work, you've got Lancet, New England Journal is probably the two most prestigious. Okay, so it's that level. And what this study showed was that over 6 months, weight loss was significantly greater in the low carb than the low fat. By 12 months, they reported no difference. Now, the means between the two groups were actually numerically different, but in that study, about half the people, it was one of the studies with the poorest compliance, about half the people had dropped out. So it was a relatively small group, and without the risks associated with going into a statistical discussion. The reason it was not significant, and why I said that it didn't persist, why that author said that, was because it was too small of a group to detect anything. So no surprise there. But what was interesting about it is, if you look at the discussion, the way that those authors wrote the results in terms of safety was kind of interesting. So what they said was, yes, you lose more weight on low carb, and I'm paraphrasing here, and your HDL, your good cholesterol, goes up, and your triglycerides, which are not the horribly bad cholesterol, but certainly in the bad category, go down. But they said, we don't know whether a diet changing these parameters means that the risk will change. Now, what's interesting about that is that there's no evidence that a diet that changes LDL, which wasn't statistically lower but was numerically lower in low fat, that changes outcome either. So it becomes this whole one-sided thing. You've got a diet low fat that's convention, that's been standard for the last 40 years, where there's not evidence that it clearly lowers risk. And there have been studies that have tried to show it and have not been able to show it. Large NIH-funded trials, Women's Health Initiative, et cetera, as one. And then what you do is you say, okay, well, wait, this is the intellectual conflict of interest. But I believe in low fat, so I'll ignore the fact that it's not been shown to have risk reduction. And now I'm looking at low carb, but I have this intellectual conflict for low fat. Well, yeah, low carb sort of loses weight, but nobody's shown that it reduces risk. They could have applied risk equations to their data to see if they actually really wanted to ask the question. But it's stuff like that I find irritating, because it's not appreciated in the medical community how insidious that intellectual conflict is. And what we have now is data and a conclusion that have a very high level of confidence, 98% likely, that your predicted risk is going to be lower on low carb than low fat. So not only do you have better weight loss, but you have better effects on risk reduction. So that's really the only two reasons to do it. So, I've had people ask me, I don't practice at this point, but have asked me either in my community or other doctors who I'm still friends with from the days I was in practice, who will say to me, well, what do you tell, what would you tell people? I say, well, I only see two reasons to do something, either because it makes you feel better, sort of a quality, which I'd put the weight loss in, or it affects your risk, your safety. If both are aligned, then why would you choose anything else as a starting point? But by the same token, there's incredible variability in human behavior and human physiology. For me, a low-carb diet is actually really easy to do, as opposed to the way you describe the transition in your book, which is what patients used to tell me, where it's really hard for the first few weeks. I actually felt better about 2 days later. And I thought to myself, my God, why do I feel so different? And then it continued, and I wasn't ketotic at the beginning. I was checking, and I wasn't losing much weight, but I felt I had my digestive system was, all of a sudden I said, oh, this is what normal's supposed to be. This is pretty good. I had much more energy, much more alertness, and could do more. And it was, so therefore for me, it was really easy. Not everybody's going to find it easy, and some people are going to find it hard but doable, and some people are going to find it impossible. And then they have to try another diet. But they should at least start with the idea that there's a payoff for putting up with that difficulty if they face any at the beginning, because it's more likely to work and more likely to be safe.
I mean, that's probably the best point to stop at, Dr. Sackner-Bernstein. But I mean, it's just more likely, so it's just a better starting point all in all. Now, I mean, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you so much for your efforts with this meta-analysis. I'm sure it's going to go a long way to hopefully convincing the current establishment that at least they should recommend it in some form. You wanted to say something, sorry, Jonathan?
Absolutely, and it's attention from people like you that I think help make sure the message gets out there. You have a great way of communicating it clearly with much less jargon than I do, so I'm glad you're spreading the message.
Try my best, sir. Now, you've got a couple of places where people can get in touch with you on Twitter, which is twitter.com/JSBMD if you want to follow Jonathan on Twitter. I believe you're also on LinkedIn if people want to get in touch with you business-wise. And you've also got a website, which is jsbmd.com as well. Was there anywhere else where you wanted to you'd be able to find me. If you've got those, you'll be able to find me, and I'm happy to engage. Absolutely fantastic. And that only leaves us one more thing to do, and that's something that we do at the end of every single interview, and that's to hear a smash it out from our interviewee. So on the count of 3, I want you to shout "smash it out" to the camera.
Okay.
So 1, 2, 3.
Smash the fat.
Awesome. There we go. That's fantastic, Doc. Thank you so much again. Everybody check out Jonathan's meta-analysis. If you go to +1 and put in his name, Jonathan Sackner-Bernstein, I'm sure it will come up, or you can click in the links in the description below if you're on YouTube. Now, were there any other wise words that you wanted to leave us with at all, Doc?
Just thanks to you and also to your audience.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.